Very good afternoon to everybody, and I welcome all of you for this PIC Adda. In this year 2022, we are meeting after a very long time, and this is the first offline PIC Adda after around 2.5 years. So it's very nice to see this offline event happening, and we have a very good speaker today. So PIC, everybody knows Pune International Center is like a think tank with more than 300 odd people who are the members of this particular forum, and there are a lot of activities which keep on continuously going on under PIC. They are in terms of policy papers, there are seminars, conferences. There are many events which go on under social innovation, defense applications, and things and so on. PIC Adda is one of them, and here we always have a speaker from different domains of the current affairs, and we have their talks. Initially, we had this as a closed forum. We only used to invite only PIC members, but since this pandemic has started, we've kept it open for everybody. And in that sense, this is a first open event happening offline on the PIC platform. So, just to introduce the topic of today, it's a well known topic, but we all know that in the beginning of 2020, Chinese and Indian troops were engaged in an aggressive battle and face off at the Sino India border, Ladakh area, Tibet area, border area between Sikkim and Tibet. Where was the main area where all these things have happened. This was one of the significant events in the recent Indian history. There are many things that have gone therein, and there are so many lessons too that could be learned, and the way ahead, which will be useful to know, and therefore to enlighten all of us on this particular topic. We have an extremely good speaker with us today, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale. He is a former Indian ambassador to China and Bhutan and former Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan. He is also the trustee of PIC. We all know him very, very well. However, I will quickly introduce you to the speaker. Bambawale sir joined Indian Foreign Service in 1984. He studied at Mandarin Chinese and served in the Indian missions in Hong Kong and Beijing. Upon his return, he joined Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi, and he served as a first desk officer for China in the ministry. From 1993 to 1994, he was a director in the Americas division of ministry. Since 1994 to around 1998, he was the director of Indian Culture Center. From March 2001 to June 2002, he worked at Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi as a staff officer to Foreign Secretary of India. Subsequently, he functioned at Prime Minister's office in New Delhi as Deputy Chief in the Division of National Security Affairs, Defense and International Policy. He was a Minister of Political and Head Political Wing in Indian Embassy in Washington, D.C. from July to September 2007. From December 2009 to 2014, he was a Joint Secretary East Asia at Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi. He also served as the Indian ambassador to Bhutan from August 2014 to December 2015 and High Commissioner to India to Pakistan from January 2016 to November 2017. He is considered as an expert in China issues. So we are very happy, sir, to have you here with me. Along with Kedkar sir and everybody else from Pune International Center, I welcome you, sir, here, and I request you to deliver your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sangeeta, and thank you for coming out on a Saturday. What I'm going to talk about is this topic which is up here, understanding Galwan to galvanize India. So let me try to start by explaining what I mean by understanding Galwan to galvanize India. As all of us know, that it has been a little over 2 years that there was a very serious clash at Galwan on the night of 15th and early morning of 16 June 2020. So it's been a little over 2 years. And in that clash between Indian soldiers and Chinese soldiers, where no guns or no artillery was used, but there were things like sticks and bayonets, which had been prepared by both sides, which were used. We know that 20 Indian soldiers, including an officer, died in that incident. And we know that many more than the four deaths which have been accepted and admitted by the Chinese government took place on the Chinese side. We don't have a figure of how many Chinese soldiers died that night, but it is definitely more than the four which has been accepted by Chinese government. So that was a seminal event in India-China relations in recent times because of the fact that India-China border over almost 20 odd years, 25 years, had been relatively peaceful. And what happened on the night of 15-16 June 2020 was the first time that soldiers on both Indian and Chinese sides were killed in action in over 20 odd years. And in fact, I would also like to point out that it was the first casualties that the People's Liberation Army of China was taking after the 1979 war that they had with Vietnam. So from 1979 till 2020, the Chinese People's Liberation Army had not had any casualties in battle. So I think it's a seminal event in India-China relations, and which has completely changed the character and nature of India-China relations. And that is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes so that I leave enough time for all of you to ask questions. I'm sure that there will be plenty of questions. So let me start by saying that, in the recent past, I have been able to travel around India quite a lot. And when I talk to ordinary people, when I talk to ordinary Indians across the whole spectrum of professions, whether they are academics, whether they are students, whether they are in business, whether they are in journalism, I find that a lot of them have the belief, and this is what they say to me. They say that, look, this is not the first time that there has been a confrontation between Indian and Chinese troops. And they point to the fact that in 2013, in a place called Depsang, which is also in Ladakh, there was a face-off between Indian and Chinese troops. Then again in 2014, in a place called Chumar, which is also in Ladakh, southern Ladakh, there was again a face-off between Indian and Chinese troops, and that was at a time when President Xi Jinping of China was actually paying an official visit to India. In fact, he had reached Ahmedabad, and he and Prime Minister Modi were shown on that swing in Ahmedabad. And at the same time, there was a face-off taking place at this place called Chumar in Ladakh between Indian soldiers and Chinese soldiers. And then, of course, all of you would have read about the face-off which happened in Doklam in 2017, which is in Bhutan. And that was a much longer face-off over about 72 days and so on. So what the people say is that, look, there were face-offs between Indian troops and Chinese troops in 2013, in 2014, in 2017. But every time, once the face-off was resolved, the relationship went back to what it was earlier. It went back to normal. It became business as usual. So why will it not happen this time? Once you're able to resolve Eastern Ladakh, why will the relationship not go back to what it was before Eastern Ladakh started? And I'll try to explain to you why that cannot happen. And this is what I've been trying to do. I've been trying to explain to people why that cannot happen. I would say that maybe, this aspect has not been sufficiently explained by the government of India to the people of India. But perhaps it is also incumbent on people like us who understand what's been happening there, even though we no longer serve in the government of India, to explain to the people of India why this Eastern Ladakh is a different kettle of fish, why it is different from all the previous incidents in 2013, 14, 17, etc. And the reason why it is different is because in 2013, in 2014, in Chumar, in 2017 at Doklam in Bhutan, the f- Indian troops and the Chinese troops came face to face, came to a situation of close proximity by accident, because there were Indians patrol, and Indian patrol was going into Depsang in 2013, and a Chinese patrol was also patrolling that same area, and accidentally they came face to face, and then there was a face off for a few weeks among small numbers of troops, but of course there was a build up as things proceeded. Same thing happened in 2014 in Chumar, and almost the same thing happened in 2017 in Doklam. But in 2020, what the Chinese have done is, it is not an accidental meeting or an accidental coming to face with each other, an accidental close proximity situation between Indian and Chinese troops. In fact, Eastern Ladakh in 2020, April of 2020 or May of 2020, when it started, was not an accident. It was a premeditated, it was a well thought out, it was a planned action by the PLA, and they used large numbers of troops, almost two divisions of troops, which is about anywhere from 50,000 to 70,000 troops. So, this is why Eastern Ladakh is quite different from what happened in 2013, 2014, and 2017. And let me also say that, by moving these large numbers of troops, almost two divisions or more than two divisions of troops, 50 to 70,000 soldiers, to Eastern Ladakh in the summer of 2020, the Chinese were actually violating all the bilateral agreements that existed between India and China for the maintenance of peace and tranquility in the India-China border areas. And why were they violating it? Because in almost all these agreements, and there are 5 or 6 of them, the earliest was in 1993, which was called the bilateral peace and tranquility agreement. There was a 1996 confidence building agreement, and so on down the line. There were almost 5 or 6 of these agreements. And the first paragraph, or the chapeau paragraph of all these agreements, says that neither side will move large numbers of troops to the border area without notifying the other side. So, by moving these large numbers of troops, almost, I would say, more than two divisions of troops, 50,000 to 70,000 troops to Eastern Ladakh, the Chinese, and without notifying us, of course, because if we had notified us, we would have probably sent in more troops ourselves at the start. So, without notifying us, they moved these large numbers of troops to Eastern Ladakh, and therefore we can come to the very logical conclusion that this was a well thought out, well planned, premeditated, reasonably well executed operation by the Chinese PLA. So, my first point is this, that the nature of what has happened and is continuing to happen in Eastern Ladakh is very different from what happened in Depsang in 2013, Chumar in 2014, Doklam in 2017. And so the next question which logically comes to our mind is, what were the Chinese objectives? What were they trying to achieve by moving these large numbers of troops to Eastern Ladakh? What were they wanting to do? What were their objectives? What were they trying to achieve? And you must have read a lot in the newspapers that, they were reacting to something India had done in the state of Jammu and Kashmir by now, making it the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir on August 5, 2019. Or you may have read that one of the reasons is because India was getting too close to the United States. Now, I believe that all those are just rationalizations. They're not the real reason. There have to be military objectives and strategic objectives for the Chinese to have undertaken what they did in Eastern Ladakh. And my answer to this question is, there are two reasons why the Chinese did Eastern Ladakh and continue to do Eastern Ladakh. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. Even 2 years down the line, we have not resolved the problems in Eastern Ladakh. They continue. So, why is it that the Chinese moved their troops in such large numbers? What were their objectives? And there are basically two objectives, in my opinion. One is a tactical objective, a more military objective. The other is a more strategic or geopolitical objective. The tactical objective or the military objective is that the Chinese realized that there were some parts of that territory, of that geography in eastern Ladakh, which they claimed, but they did not actually physically control on the ground. And because of that, what was happening was that Indian troops also used to patrol that area. Chinese troops also used to patrol that area. And as I mentioned earlier, that was the reason why there were face-offs in 2013 and 14 in the same region of Ladakh. So the Chinese military or their tactical objective was to actually hold the ground, move to the ground that they claimed, but they didn't have actual control of. And to a certain extent, their military objectives have been achieved, but to a certain extent, they have also not been achieved. And I can give you one example that, the agreement that has been arrived between India and China on the north bank of Pankong Lake is that the Chinese will stay behind what is called Finger 8, the Indians will stay behind Finger 4, and you have this in between sort of area which will be a no man's area. So because of that, what is happening is that the troops are now a little further away from each other, and therefore they are not coming into close proximity with each other as they used to do, even on the north bank of Pankong So. And I'm sure some of you have, visited Pankong Lake, Pankong So in as tourists. So this is the military objective, and some of that military objective has been achieved, but not all of it. And the reason it was not achieved was, of course, because India made a matching commitment of troops, sent in equal number of soldiers, between 50 to 60,000, to that part of eastern Ladakh, to those parts of eastern Ladakh where the Chinese had moved. And to a certain extent, in some areas, we blocked them. I won't go into details about military operations because I'm not an expert on that. Many of you might know all that much better than me. But on the one hand, this was one of the reasons why the Chinese did it. And today now we find ourselves that there is no territory in eastern Ladakh where you can have patrols of the two sides coming into close proximity with each other, which was also one of the objectives that the Chinese had. So there is this objective, which is more a tactical or a military objective. But what is more disturbing is the strategic or geopolitical objective that the Chinese had. And what is that strategic or geopolitical objective? That geopolitical objective is very simple. It is to show India, to show other countries in Asia, and to show countries across the world, particularly the United States, that in Asia, China is the big brother. China is the hegemon. China is the big power in Asia. And everyone else, including India or other countries, are all small players and bit players in this geography in Eastern in Asia. So this is the strategic objective of China. And you have to understand that, that there is increasing competition between the rising power, which is China, and the existing power, which is the United States. And today's geopolitics, the hallmark of that is not Russia and Ukraine. It is the competition which is increasing between USA on one hand and China on the other. And this competition is going to last for the next 30 to 40 years, for 3 to 4 decades. That is the important hallmark which characterizes geopolitics today. And in that strategic competition between the two most important powers of the world, China wants to show the United States that I am the big boy in Asia. I am the big brother in Asia. I am the hegemon in Asia. And this is a message that it wants to send to other countries in Asia, other countries in the world, and particularly to the United States. So I think this is the real strategic or geopolitical reason why they undertook Eastern Ladakh. And of course, to a certain extent, it will continue. I don't see the Chinese, wanting to completely resolve what's happening in Eastern Ladakh. And which brings me to, of course, a comparison and contrast of the Indian positions on Eastern Ladakh and the Chinese position on Eastern Ladakh. Now, as all of you know, Indian position on what's happened in Eastern Ladakh since April, May of 2020 continues even now, is that unless there is peace on the borders between India and China, we cannot have the rest of the relationship moving as it was before all this started. So the Indian position is, without peace on the border, there can be no business as usual. And by business, I don't just mean economics, I don't mean trade and investment. By business as usual, I mean also that there will not be the usual exchanges between government officers, between government departments, between ministers, etc. And you will see that apart from the two foreign ministers talking to each other, and of course the military authorities talking to each other on the border, there is no interaction taking place between government of India and the government of China. That has all come to an halt after Eastern Ladakh started. So, and the government of India has taken many other steps, many other measures to show its displeasure with what the Chinese have done in Eastern Ladakh. I'll give you just two examples. One is Chinese companies have not been allowed to participate in India's 5G trial and rollout. We have kept Huawei and other Chinese companies like ZTE out of our 5G trials and rollouts. And this is one of the impacts of Eastern Ladakh. And I am very happy because I have been saying this for a long time, that we should keep Chinese companies out of 5G in India, and it has happened. I don't know if it has happened for the reasons I was advocating it, but it's definitely happened because of as a reaction of India to Eastern Ladakh. The other thing that you would have seen is that India has tightened up its foreign direct investment regulations to make it more difficult for countries from our neighboring countries to invest in India. So that is again one of the things which the government has taken. And all of you would have seen that in recent times, many Chinese companies have been getting into trouble with our regulators for some of their practices. I don't want to take individual names because I don't know how these things will pan out. But there have been Chinese companies which have got into trouble with our regulators on various legal issues in India. So India's position on the boundary is that unless there is peace on the border, India-China relations cannot go ahead, and it cannot be business as usual. What is the Chinese position? Chinese position is diametrically opposite, 180 degrees opposite. And you would have read that about 2 months ago, Chinese Foreign Minister Mr. Wang Yi visited Delhi for 2 days. A lot of my friends asked me, why the hell is he coming? And the reason he was coming was basically to test the waters, whether there is any change in Indian position on what has happened over the last 2 years. The Chinese position is exactly the opposite of the Indian position. The Chinese position is this, that look, for many years we have bifurcated border issues from the rest of the relationship. We will continue to talk about the border and discuss it, but we will not hold the rest of the relationship, whether it's in trade, investment, people-to-people exchanges, government-to-government exchanges. We will not hold that hostage to what's happening on the border. So they're arguing that these are two different compartments and you have to discuss it totally separately. But we, of course, don't agree with that. We take the opposite view. Unless there's peace on the border, there can be no business as usual. Now, let me come to the main point, which is, that all this is about understanding Galwan. Now, why I use to galvanize India? As I told you, as I travel around India, I find that most ordinary people don't understand that this Galwan or Eastern Ladakh is a different kettle of fish. It's different from what has happened in the past. And therefore, the India-China relationship, in my view, not only has deteriorated over the last 2 years, but it will never go back to what it was before that. And this is something which I find little understanding amongst ordinary people. They believe that once Eastern Ladakh is resolved, things will go back to as they were before. And this is particularly true of business people who are just waiting for the opportunity to visit China and start importing all kinds of things that they want. Let me also say that India has been quite practical. We have not stopped trade, but at the same time, the government of India is very, very cognizant, is very aware of the fact that India is far too import dependent on China in certain critical areas. And I'll give you just one area. Uh, Active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs. We import almost 70% of our imports come from China of API. So things like penicillin, etc., all of which goes into formulations that we make and then export again. So we are far too import dependent on China, and the government is already beginning to move with industry to ensure that APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, are manufactured in India itself. All of us in Pune know about Hindustan antibiotics. How Hindustan antibiotics actually went down because of cheap imports of similar pharmaceutical products from China. So there are moves to revive such companies. Of course, it has to be on the basis of competitive advantage. Of course, it has to be on basis of being a profitable firm, of keeping costs competitive, of being low cost, etc. But there is a move to sort of reduce India's import dependence on some of these items on which we are very dependent on Chinese imports. So, which brings me to the question that, how does India tackle this China challenge, which is looming ahead of us and which is already in front of us? How does India tackle this challenge in the years ahead? And in the long run, of course, the way to tackle it is to have fast-paced economic growth in India. And we must ensure that India's GDP growth rates are higher than the GDP growth rates in China. Because if China grows at 4 or 5% per annum, we will need even higher GDP growth rates of 8, 9, 10% to catch up with China or even reduce the asymmetry with China. As all of you know, today India is a $3 trillion economy, China is a $15 trillion economy. So there's a gap of 1:5. And to reduce this asymmetry, we need to have high-paced, fast-paced economic growth, and definitely growth at a much faster pace than that of China, because when a $15 trillion economy grows at a 3.5%, 4%, 5% rate of growth per annum, it adds a huge amount every year. When a $3 trillion economy grows at 7%, it adds less than what the Chinese are adding. So if we have to reduce the asymmetry between India and China, we need to grow at a faster pace. And in that sense, I would argue that the geopolitical situation today, where reliability of supply chains is a very important factor, is something which is of a positive nature for India. And I'll give you one example. Apple, which used to manufacture all its mobile phones in China, has told its suppliers, all the Taiwanese companies, Foxconn, Pegatron, Wistron, Apple told them, you also, apart from China, you continue manufacturing in China, to also go to India and manufacture there, and they've begun manufacturing in India. So I think the geopolitical climate is good for India, is positive for India. But of course, eventually we need to pull up our own socks. We need to make it easy to do business in India. And despite whatever the rankings, there used to be rankings till recently. Now the World Bank has stopped doing these ease of doing business rankings completely. But till recently, we used to say we're going up these rankings and so on. But we need to change the business environment on the ground, make it easier to do business on the ground itself. So I think that's the answer. Over the long run, for 20 to 25 years, India needs to grow at high-paced growth so that asymmetry with China will come down. And once the economic asymmetry comes down, you will also have less asymmetry in military matters, in science and technology, in education, etc. But as John Maynard Keynes, the economist, said, in the long run, we're all dead. So what should we do in the short run? In the short run, what India should do and is doing is we have to balance Chinese power by building our partnerships with other countries in the world. So, United States, Japan, Australia, India, nothing but the Quad. So you can see that India is trying to balance Chinese power by building strong partnerships with countries like in the Quad, and that's only one example, to balance Chinese power so that we can continue to exist in, so that in the long run we can reduce the asymmetry between our two countries. And it's not just these four countries, these three countries, but also countries like France, like Germany, like United Kingdom, like South Korea, like Indonesia. We need to build our partnerships with them so that together with them we can balance out Chinese power in the short run. So that's what I have been wanting to talk about. We need to understand Galwan in order to galvanize India to grow fast over the long run, and in the short run to galvanize India to balance Chinese power through strategic partnerships. And I won't use the word alliances because in India alliance is a bad word, but we need to do that. And I'll end with one last thought, Sangeeta, if you permit me, and leave the rest of the time for questions. Whatever we may say that, India is non-aligned or strategic autonomy, we have to see that what is coming, the geopolitical train which is coming at us in a longer perspective, maybe 20 years, 30 years down the line, is this competition of an authoritarian worldview, which is the Chinese worldview, and a more democratic, open, transparent world system, which is the United States. And I have a feeling that we can sit on the fence only for some of the time. We cannot sit on the fence for all the time. And if we have to choose between these two strategic competitors in the long run, I have no doubt that India's own values of democracy, openness, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual, the kind of ethos we have in India will make us come down on the side of the United States of America. Chinese authoritarian worldview will not be suitable to India. So I can see that happening, that we might have strategic autonomy today, and we should have strategic autonomy, not just today, but also 20 years down the line. But that very strategic autonomy will lead India to side with the American view of the world rather than the Chinese view of the world. I'll end there, Sangeeta, and stop and leave the time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for a very, very interesting talk. It is really nice to, I'll quickly summarize as to what all we have learned through the talk, how the things were different in 2013, 14, 17 vis-a-vis what happened in 2020. Really, sir, actually, I was not aware. I'm sure many of us were really not aware of it. How the operations were critically different in 2020 as against what had happened earlier. It is nice to know that the reasons were tactical on one side, they were also strategic on the other side, and how India has taken some steps when this particular set of events happened in the Galwan area. Typically related to the 5G trials and also related to the foreign direct investments, the restrictions that we have imposed on China as a country, and of course the galvanizing part of it, that is how we are trying to cope up with it and how are we trying to get ready to handle this particular issue. In some sense, I would say that it's a kind of a silver lining, in the sense that now we would be really looking into the way in which India can do more partnerships with different countries and try to become independent in terms of multiple things such as imports and such others. Thank you, sir, for a very nice talk. I leave the forum open for question and answers. So we'll start up with question and answers, please. Yes.
May I?
Yeah.
Couple of points. Thanks, Gautam. One, you said 50 to 70,000 forces were coming. Did our intelligence, satellite imaging not tell us this was happening? Well, we didn't have to wait till 15 June. So there must have been some early signals and we could have reacted. Just a question. Second, you said, yes, we have taken all this. In the last 2 years, our imports from China have gone up. The balance of trade has actually, in fact, increased in favor of China. So do you think these gradual Atmanirbharta and other alliances is the only way, or we need to do something more drastic? These questions. Thank you.
We'll take each question by itself so that it'll be easier for answer. On your question of whether there was an intelligence failure, etc., I don't know the answer to that. I'm also outside government, but I think once the Chinese troops had started arriving in eastern Ladakh, we quickly built up matching strength on our side. So we were able to hold them off in certain parts, and I think, in my opinion, all the military objectives that the PLA may have had when they started this have not been achieved. Some of them have been achieved, but not all. So I don't want to go into that aspect of intelligence failure and all that. There's no point in wringing your hands. Let's do something about it. That's my approach. And on the balance of trade, I agree with you. The facts speak, as you rightly pointed out, that in 2021, trade between India and China actually increased from the earlier $90 billion to $120 billion. The balance of trade became even more adverse. The trade deficit that India faced vis-a-vis China became even more. But I think 1 year is too soon to make a final analysis. Let's wait for the next 4 or 5 years more, and then we take a view of what's happening. But also keep in mind that trade with all countries increased in 2021 because it was a comeback after 2 years of the pandemic. So if you look at trade figures and statistics for all countries, they actually increased in 2022, sorry, not 2021. Or 2021, sorry. So trade, in India's trade with almost all its major partners increased, and it also increased vis-a-vis China. But I would say that we need to wait for a longer period of time for some of the measures to kick in before we make a final decision on that. So, but I agree with you that actually trade increased with China post Eastern Ladakh. But I think there are other factors which explain that increase in trade. Thank you.
Hello, sir. Taking ahead the asymmetric economic question of yours, point of yours, China is actually proposing other nations to use yuan as a currency to trade instead of US dollars. And African nations, Saudi Arabia, and our favorite partner or neighbor, Pakistan, have actually considered this offer. So what kind of impact would it have when we are looking for building our strategic partnership? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and let me say that it is not only recently that the Chinese have been trying to make efforts to make the yuan international currency, but so far at least they're only efforts because the yuan is not completely convertible, and that is a huge problem for the Chinese and for the internationalization of the Chinese yuan. All you need to do is ask the people here, do you prefer to hold US dollars or will you hold Chinese yuan? And the answer from 99.9% will be, I will hold US dollars. So, that's the effort so far. But no, those who have a loan from China, it makes sense to pay back in Chinese yuan. So, that is, but even if you ask those countries, how much of your foreign exchange reserves are you holding in dollar and how much are you holding in Chinese yuan? The answer will be very stark. There's a stark difference, at least today, between the US dollar and the Chinese yuan. Chinese yuan is not really close to being an international currency, though the Chinese have been making efforts consistently over the last 10, maybe 15 years, and they will continue to make those efforts. And who knows what will happen as we go ahead, because it brings me to the point that there's a lot spoken about the China dream. Now, the China dream is basically, there are two aspects to what that dream consists of. One aspect is domestically, China wants to become a highly advanced country with high per capita incomes and a high standard of living for its people. That's one part of the China dream. Other part of the China dream is the international aspect, where China wants to overtake the United States as the most important, the most the strongest sort of player internationally. And in that, it is not just military power, but also economic power, etc., which is built in. So when you look at the China dream, their objective is to do that. And their objective is to come back to your question, to have the yuan as an internationally accepted global currency. But it's still going to take time for that to happen. It's not there as yet today. Thank you.
Ambassador, you have said that you have given the tactical reasons why the Galwan took place in 2020. I'm just trying to give shape to that a little bit. By being a military man, I got experience of Ladakh plenty. What I've read somewhere recently is that India has built the road from Shok to Darbuk, Shok to Tibio, Daulat Begoldi. And that road is a good road now. So they felt very threatened that we might lead on to and threaten Karakoram highway. That is possibly the reason why they have undertaken this.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I stayed away from the military aspects because I'm not an expert on that. But thank you for pointing it out. I think that's an important tactical reason for the Chinese having undertaken what they did in April 2020, and which continues today. Thank you so much for that input. Thank you, sir. Please go ahead.
Sir, we are negotiating with China to sort out various issues. But considering the behavior pattern of China up till now, how far response will be reliable? As compared to this, if we emphasize on self-reliance and reduce the import from China, it will be favorable to India's economic situation. So what is your opinion actually?
My opinion is what I said earlier, that in certain sectors, I have no problem with international trade. And as two large countries, India and China, will obviously trade with each other. There's nothing wrong with that. But there are certain sectors right now where India's dependence on imports from one source, which is China, is very high. And I think we need to sort of distribute that risk. So you can import from other countries, you can manufacture in India if we can. All that should be tried and should be done. As far as negotiating with China is concerned, yes, for example, boundary is an issue that we have been negotiating with China. And we have not come to any kind of conclusion as yet, because of which you have tensions on the border, including what has happened in Eastern Ladakh. But as I was trying to explain, that Eastern Ladakh is a totally different kettle of fish compared to what has happened in earlier times between Indian and Chinese troops. So that's just to expand, that's the point I was trying to make. Thank you for your question.
Thanks for your talk. Actually, my question has to do with back from 1980 all the way up to 2015, China had an internal focus where they were just focusing on the economy. And there was a sort of a peaceful sort of coexistence positioning that they had with their neighbors. Just in the last 8 years or 10 years, they have transitioned into flexing their muscle. Is it an individual who's acting out this with sort of a legacy in mind? Or is it a consensus view across the establishment, tier 1 and tier 2? And a follow-up to that is, if there is regime change anytime in the next 5 to 10 years, will the next regime also, you feel, continue this sort of policy of being aggressive about their geopolitical interests? Or do you feel that, again, over the last 200, 300 years, transitions, whenever there have been geopolitical transitions, UK to US was possibly a peaceful one. But Germany coming in the early part of the last century was a much more violent one. So do you anticipate a more violent transition over the next 20, 30 years? Or do you feel there's a possibility of a peaceful one?
Thank you. That's a very good question and a very challenging question. But let me try taking it head on. As I tell a lot of people, I am no longer a serving diplomat, so I can be as undiplomatic as I want to. So I'll try to be direct, frank, undiplomatic, and give you my views and my opinion. What you've said is absolutely right. You said that between 1980 to 2015, China was relatively less assertive and aggressive in its international policy, focused domestically on growing its economy. That was, the Deng approach, the Deng Xiaoping approach to China's focus. He said, as you know, and it's been quoted all over the place, so you have heard of this quote, that China, at least in its international aspects, must hide its strength and bide its time. So right up till 2008, I would say that China was hiding its strength, biding its time, and also building up its own economic muscle. And we know that between 1980 and 2008-9, China grew so rapidly at roughly 10% GDP growth per annum. Every year, 10% on an average. So China by then had become the second largest economy in the world. But in 2008, when the global financial crisis took place, there was a change in appraisal by the Chinese leadership. And that time, remember, it was not the current leader, Xi. It was the previous leader, Hu Jintao. And the Chinese approach then became more assertive and more aggressive in its international behavior. Because they felt that, with the global financial crisis, the Western world was in crisis and was actually weakening. And that this was the time for China no longer to hide its strength and bide its time. It believed that it believes that China's time has come. So I think that's the change in approach. It is not one person, it is the group of leaders. So it started with the previous General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Mr. Hu Jintao. It continues again under the current person. The current person is much more aggressive in his outlook. There's no doubt about that. But I think it's also aggressive. He's also aggressive, or China is also aggressive because, when it makes an appraisal, it sees that it is quite powerful, both economically, militarily, and otherwise, even scientifically, and so on, in terms of, the science and research which is being undertaken in China. So I think they feel that their time has come. They are now focused not on India. They are not focused on Japan. They're focused on the United States and overtaking the United States in economic terms, but also in general power terms, what the Chinese call comprehensive national power. And they want to be the number one power in the world, the superpower in the world, which they believe they were in, for 200 years, from 1500 to 1700, roughly. Right till the Industrial Revolution took place, and a little after that, till the Opium War took place in the 1840s. So I think China is focused on that. I don't think it's an individual thing. It's a group think, and it is based on what is their appraisal of power and the power situation of China vis-a-vis other countries in the world. As far as regime change is concerned, I don't see any possibility of a regime change in China that is an overthrow of the Communist Party of China. So it doesn't matter if it's Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, or whoever may come in the future. China's attitudes and China's behavior, particularly internationally, will continue. And that's why it is so important for us to think about the future. And how can India rise to the China challenge is a book that 5-6 of us, including Dr. Kelkar and myself, we wrote. Because there's no point, as I said, can't just wring our hands and say, ki, hi, kya kare. We have to give some path forward, and that path forward is, of course, through strategic patience, economic growth, and in the shorter run, through balancing Chinese power. So that's Pune International Center's suggestions to India, to Indians, to the government of India on what we need to do. So I think we need to be prepared for the coming sort of rising an ever rising China. And I also believe that, because there was a question earlier about negotiating with China, I believe that, today's communist China is, in a certain sense, and is a certain way, quite similar to Nazi Germany. You cannot appease that country. Appeasing that country is not going to stop it to come after what it wants. I'm not saying we're headed for a war or a world war. No, we'll have to wait and see. But appeasing China is not the answer to managing China's rise or dealing with China's rise. So I'll say that I've been very undiplomatic, and I don't know if there are any. There is at least one well-known journalist, Mr. K.P. Nair, from who's here, and I hope he quotes me correctly, KP. Don't blow it out of proportion. Thank you for an excellent question. Thank you, sir.
Gautam ji,
Yes,
you said you will be undiplomatic, and you are. I think you ended on note that we have a American model to follow. But given the predicament of the world today, I mean, climate catastrophe and climate emergency is the fact of life. And after pandemic, I think we have learned a lesson. Given that, I mean, that China and America both cannot be a model for humankind to follow. I mean, look at the way the whole thing is happening. And given, I have an observation and a very quick question. Observation is that, given the fact that the economic disparities, social discord, and ecological destructions are the issues besieging the humankind, and all our work as economists, as diplomats, as a social activists is coming to naught. And time, now enough is enough. It is a time that we have to take a pathway which is both ecologically sane and ethically sound. And this is observation. Question is, do you think that India is still a democratic country?
Let me start with your last question first, because that's the easiest to answer. I'm not going into that at all, because I'm not talking about domestic politics. I'm talking about India's international relations, focus on China. But sir, let me say that what you've said is absolutely right. You are 100% correct. I would take your question as, can India lead the world in this direction, which you have suggested? And the realist theory in international affairs, in international relations, and I'm a firm believer in that. India today does not have the power to make its presence completely felt. We have enough power to be one of the players in the world, but we are not in the same category as the United States and China. So we now need to do what Deng Xiaoping had told China to do. Keep our head down, hide our strength, bide our time, and enhance our economic and other strengths. So India needs to focus on that, and perhaps in the future, India may be a power which could lead the world in the direction which you have rightly pointed out, because we cannot continue to think in real power or real politic terms. We have to think we have to think of humanity as a whole, and what is going to be good for all people, all human beings across the world. So I see where your question is coming from, but I feel that India today doesn't have the power to be the leader in this effort to have a more ethical sort of international system. And the international system for the next 30 years, at least 3 decades, is going to be characterized by strategic competition between USA and China. And we will have to live in that world and find our way forward in that world. I completely agree with you that India doesn't need to follow an American path or a Chinese path. But we need to make our own path, but for that we need to have adequate power to as a nation, as a country. Thank you, sir.
मैं आपसे पूरी तरह एक सहमत हूँ, लेकिन सवाल ये है कि ये इकोनॉमिक पावर से नहीं आएगा,
कि इंडिया की इकोनॉमिक पावर से ये मॉरल स्ट्रेन या इथिकल, yes, world is a, I mean, world is not a morality play, we know, and the power games as they are. But I think time has come. Well, why? I mean, otherwise we should at least cease to do one thing, take a name of Mahatma Gandhi. At least that sin we should not commit. And I think given the fact that the authoritarianism, we are the worst polluters today. I mean, we are going the Chinese way, the American way. India, and billion people. Gautamji, my concern, and you were in Bhutan, I wrote to you and all that, and Professor H.N. Desai from all
Yes.
आज भारत में billion people in India, and Kelkar is here, billion people are living under conditions of mass deprivation. Is this the pathway? आज भारत की अगर ecological carrying capacity कम है, we owe it to this billion people. But do you want to keep them in a mass deprivation? And it's a game. आम के आम गुठलियों के दाम नहीं चलेंगे. This country being run for a top 10% people.
Sir,
will not do. I think this is a serious question Pune International Center should take. And since you are a trustee, जी हमारे से बड़े नाराज होते हैं कभी-कभी मैं क्वेश्चन पूछता हूँ. लेकिन ये क्वेश्चन नहीं पूछेंगे तो भारत को उठाना की तरफ.
yes, sir, yes. There are and parallel issues which are handled by PIC. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
आज नहीं कभी.
Your scintillating presentation has galvanized me into asking two questions, if I may. 4 days after India restructured the status of Jammu and Kashmir into union territory, the Home Minister made a statement in Parliament in which he made several references to Aksai Chin. Many of your colleagues, both serving and retired, tell me privately that it were these references to Aksai Chin which Chinese took as a threat to the status quo, which actually triggered the fatal clash in which Indian and Chinese soldiers died. Do you share that view? And my second question is with reference to what you said, that we cannot have business as usual until the situation in eastern Ladakh is resolved. But in the United Nations, we are having intense cooperation with China in the Security Council. I mean, I cannot go into details without compromising my sources, but on Afghanistan, on Ukraine, and most of all on climate change. I mean, India and China are acting together in the Security Council. On climate change, for example, the Americans and the Europeans wanted to bring a resolution equating climate situation with security issues, which would have been a pretext for future interventions on the using climate as an excuse, security interventions against countries like India. And India approached China to veto the resolution. But then the Russians offered that they will veto the resolution, and the resolution was vetoed. So in a situation where we are moving from a unipolar world again to a multipolar world and perhaps a bipolar world, aren't there compulsions which require us to cooperate with China and multilateral forums? It simply cannot be avoided, even if India's official position is that there cannot be business as usual. Do you agree with this position as well?
Okay, let me take both those questions, and let me take the first question first, because that's simpler to answer. About what India undertook as far as Jammu and Kashmir is concerned on August 5, 2019, and then statements made after that. And you said that some people think that it is this which triggered the Galwan incident, and also the overall Eastern Ladakh sort of situation. I do not agree with that at all. I do not agree with it. 100% I don't agree with it. And I'll tell you why. The Indian position has always been that Aksai Chin is a part of India. Just like the Indian position has always been that Pak-occupied Kashmir is a part of India. Jawaharlal Nehru said it in the early years after independence. And maybe we didn't say it after that, but definitely that is India's position. It hasn't changed an iota since 1947. So I don't believe that some statement made by one individual, and I don't look at individuals, I look at broad trends as a social scientist. I don't believe that, that is what caused Galwan or Eastern Ladakh. I think it is something which is far more important than that, and which I tried to explain in my talk. There's both a tactical reason and a strategic reason. And don't forget that to do something like Eastern Ladakh needs a lot of planning, formulation, thinking, which must have started well before April and May of 2020. Must have probably started well before Mr. Xi Jinping visited India for that last round of talks in Chennai or in Chennai or near Chennai. So I don't agree with that view at all. I'm 100% opposed to that view, if you can put it that way. On the business as usual, let me say that, look, I have not said that India has to stop all its interactions with the Chinese. I made that very clear, that we have been very, very practical. Trade has continued and even increased, as someone rightly pointed out. Similarly, cooperation on certain international issues has continued. We continue to attend BRICS and SCO meetings, etc. So we have taken a very practical view. But when I say that it cannot be business as usual, it doesn't mean that there are certain areas which we will target to show our unhappiness with what the Chinese have done, and to show that there is a price to be paid for doing what you did in Eastern Ladakh. And that's what I mean by no business as usual. So we should continue our cooperation, whether it's on climate change. And Sir here just mentioned how important climate change is as an issue. But that's the point I'm making, that you don't have to, continue. You don't have to completely snap off all ties with the Chinese. We have been very practical in our response, that we will continue to work with you where it is in our interest. And we will continue to work with the Americans where it is in our interest, including doing military exercises near Eastern Ladakh. Thank you.
Sir, two questions. One is, what has been the Chinese response to the Indian response to Galwan? And the second question is, how do you see the future, especially with regards to Arunachal Pradesh?
Thank you. Good questions. What has been the Chinese response to the Indian response to Galwan? They have tried to lie. They have tried to obfuscate by saying that they only had 4 of their soldiers killed there. Most estimates, including by observers outside India and outside China, put the number higher. I don't want to go into figures, but so that's been their response. If you were asking about what is their response to India's stand that as long as there's no peace on the border, the rest of the relationship cannot continue and it cannot be business as usual, their response has been to say that, no, we don't agree with this. They have a diametrically opposite position. We have a diametrically opposite position from theirs, and that's where, it stands. But as I've tried to point out, despite our cooperation in certain subjects, that there has been a pushback from India, a non-military aspects pushback also from India where the relationship is concerned. And today the India-China relationship has deteriorated severely compared to, say, 2018, when I was the ambassador to China. And it will continue to deteriorate in the coming years. So that's how I would respond to it. And on the second question about Arunachal Pradesh, Arunachal Pradesh is a part of India. That's our position. We have complete control over it. and it cannot be taken away from us except through military kind of operation. And if that happens, then we will give the right and befitting response, as military spokesman always says. So that's on Arunachal Pradesh. But you have to, I'll just end with one last point, Abhay, which is that while Jawaharlal Nehru is criticized a lot for his China policy, you have to accept that where Arunachal Pradesh is concerned, it was he who said that the Indian administration should be stretched right up till the McMahon line. And then it was Major Bob Khating who actually went and did that. So that was something which was the right thing to do. And we have to give kudos to former first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru for having done that, despite valid criticism on the rest of his China policy. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for a very, very nice talk. And I would like to also thank all the audience for extremely good questions. I think that is the beauty of Pune International Center's forum, that we not only have extremely good speakers, but we also have very good audience and an intellectual audience. So let me thank everybody here on behalf of PIC, myself, Kedkar sir, Abhay, on behalf of all of us. Thank you, sir, for coming over, and thank you to all the audience. Before I end, let me just quickly tell you about the 2 upcoming events. I've been given this job by Abhay sir. One is a webinar, which is an online webinar upcoming on 5th of September. It is on structural transformation of India and the sectoral shifts. The speaker is Dr. Uma Lele, and the event is chaired by Dr. Ajit Ranade. And there is another program on 6th of September, which is on book discussion program on how China sees India and the world. This is in conversation with Mr. Vijay Gokhale, Ambassador Shyam Saran, and the chairperson is Mr. Amit Paranspe. So I request all of you for this event, if you're interested, kindly join in. And thank you everybody again for this program. Thank you.